Our moderator here is Megan Holcomb. She's the Senior Climate Specialist at the Colorado Water Conservation Board, completing our trifecta of Colorado CWCB folks. We have Joshua Lowe from the Partnerships Director at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications. Did cover some of their stuff. Doug Parsons, Director and host of America Adapts podcast, and Andy Schultheis, he's the Executive Director at the Colorado Water Trust. Megan, your show.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for hanging with us. We're a little bit behind here, but we're about to talk about adaptation, so we're going to be okay with that and just roll with it. But I've got an awesome panel here. I'm going to kick off with a really short video, but this conversation is shifting a bit from the last two panels on Colorado Water Plan and really talking about how we talk about climate change and moving forward with climate action. So a quick recap on 2019. There's no question that 2019 was an international wake-up call on the climate crisis, and just in September 2019, there were over 2,500 events scheduled in over 163 countries on all 7 continents. These were youth, a huge range of youth, families, anyone who really feels like this is a topic that needs more attention. And I've got hopefully a video queued up here soon, just a short 2-minute video to give a recap on the international voices on this topic, and then we're going to kind of unpack how we respond and move forward with climate action, considering this increasing wave of attention on this topic.
This is a movement led by children, by college students, backed by many parents. Millions of people coming together to protest when they would normally be at school. Instead, they're calling on governments around the world to take action on climate change.
I think that it's better to miss one school day and then have a future, to not have any future and to go to school.
People need to realise that the planet is something we need to care for.
Many people are protesting here for the first time, but want to be part of this growing movement, calling on governments to do more to tackle climate change. And this truly is a global phenomenon. Across the Pacific Islands, many of which are already experiencing the impact of rising sea levels, are pledged to fight climate change. There were big protests in Australia, where several 100,000 people skipped school, college or work to take part. While in Thailand, hundreds of young people feigned death outside the Environment Ministry, demanding action.
We have come together as students. We skipped school for this. We're missing our education. To come here today, our education won't be important if we don't have a life to live for anymore.
In Indonesia, the police looked on while protesters rallied along a main road.
Climate change is not a lie. Don't let our people die.
And in India, the message was no less passionate.
So what we personally can do to help the climate is first of all change the mindsets of our government, of the people.
This protest in South Africa was no less noisy. This groundswell of global angst and passion for action and change from young people has surprised some in governments. Many have been inspired by the teenager Greta Thunberg, who last year started skipping school on Fridays to protest outside the Swedish Parliament. In just a few days, world leaders will meet in New York at the United Nations Conference on Climate Change.
We must hope, but we must also be prepared for that nothing comes out of it. And then we need to continue no matter what, because giving up cannot be an option.
The decisions world leaders make in New York will affect the future of these young people far more than themselves. It is a youth emboldened by a desire for change. Emma Hayward, Al Jazeera in London.
Thanks. So whether you find that video invigorating or upsetting. My panelists are here to help us understand how to talk about climate action and perhaps how to respond to public concerns. I'm going to just do some quick bios. I'm excited about who we have here. And then I'm going to kind of pass the torch and ask each of them to kind of elaborate on why I asked them to join today. So next to me, I have Joshua Lowe, and he's the Partnership Director at the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. He leads the program's strategy for engaging climate and clean energy media, education, and advocacy communities. Joshua has 15 years of experience in advocacy and electoral campaigns that advance bipartisan support for climate action, have elected climate champions, and has helped pass clean energy legislation in multiple states. Joshua is also here from DC, so thank you, and was recently in Steamboat this week, so just lucked out and got him in the state of Colorado. And then next we have Doug Parsons, who also traveled here from out of state, thank you. Doug is the creator and host of America Adapts, which is a climate change podcast. In Doug's words, America Adapts is not a doom and gloom climate change podcast. It's a fun, informative discussion with the world's adaptation experts. Doug has a colored background in both state and national level climate policy, serving as a climate change liaison for the National Park Service and Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. He got his start in adaptation in Australia. And then down there we have a familiar Colorado face. Andy Schultheis is the executive director of the Colorado Water Trust. Andy joined the Water Trust in 2017 after over 20 years in the conservation world. He's worked all over the American West in private, public, and nonprofit sectors. He's operated regional national programs for the League of Conservation Voters and served as chief of staff and Colorado director for Governor Polis, then Representative Polis. Thanks everyone for being here, and we'll just roll forward with the time we have. Joshua, gonna kick you off with which I thought would be an easy question, maybe a roundabout one, which is, in your words for the audience, what is climate change communications, and can you tell us a little bit more about the Yale program?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. So communication is the exchanging of ideas and information and views amongst people. And so the Yale program on climate change communication studies audiences, people's views, attitudes, behaviors when it comes to climate change. And so there's a wide range of how people feel about climate change, and we study it at the global level, the national level, and the state level, and the local level. And depending on how people feel about climate change, it changes how you communicate with them, because the first step in communication is knowing your audience. Thanks.
That makes sense. Thanks. Doug, you spend a lot of time interviewing scientists, activists, policymakers, and other journalists on your podcast. Could you share a little bit with the audience how you landed in this investigator role and your interest in having these conversations with varied audiences?
Okay, first, thanks for the invite, Megan, for inviting us to come to this panel. Thanks for everybody for having us. I'm actually coming from Tucson, Arizona, and I bring greetings from the people of Tucson to have a full snowpack this year. So just, we want to encourage that. So my background actually is in policy, but I started this podcast about 3.5 years ago because I like communicating the issue of climate adaptation, and most people don't even know what it is. And I think what you're doing here with talking about water at this event, it's going to be all about adaptation, and some people were talking about it in the previous panel. A lot of big changes are going to come. It remains to be seen what's really going to happen with Colorado, but my interest is that this is a generational challenge, and most of the public has no clue what's going to happen, and there's issues around climate change. Most of what you hear is that video we just saw. A lot of it has to do with carbon emissions, but on the flip side, we're going to have to adapt to climate change, and that is going to be, in some ways, even a bigger story. We need to educate the public about it, and so, I bring on experts, and we have these long discussions on what people are doing, and so I've been very fortunate that it isn't doom and gloom. It's like, what are we doing now today to deal with sea level rise, drought, and all these impacts that are only going to grow? And so, yeah, it was an interest in just communicating this issue, and it's been a journey for myself, just learning what people are doing.
Well, if he doesn't do it, I'll make a plug. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and I reached out to Doug because his really caught my ear, and just downloaded several, and they're really well produced and a breadth of information. So, plug for America Adapts.
Thanks, Megan.
Andy reached out to me because he was excited when he saw this panel on the draft agenda, and he's like, what is this going to be about? And I was like, well, Andy, do you want to talk about that on stage? So he got invited up here because he expressed interest, and we had a really interesting conversation about what the Water Trust is doing. So Andy, I'm sure some of the audience knows you and knows the Water Trust, but for those who don't, can you kind of expand upon your interest in this topic and your history in communications?
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, I had some interest in this topic. You could say that. It stems from operating the Water Trust, and I think many people in the room know what we do. We attempt to make rivers flow a little better by working within the market system and buying and leasing and otherwise making arrangements with water users that are hopefully win-win. And I've been doing this for a couple of years now, and this isn't the first time I've thought about this, but what we are really doing is climate change adaptation in many ways. Not just climate change, also population growth adaptation. And I talk to people, and I bring this up, and I expect eyes to light up, and they don't. And I ask them why that's not compelling. And they say, well, it feels like giving up. Focusing on adaptation feels like, we're never going to solve this mitigation problem. We're never going to reduce climate emissions, greenhouse emissions. So we're just focusing on making the best we can with a tough hand, and that doesn't feel good to people. And I try arguing back, and this is what I argue back. I say, when you make the point that we have to adapt to climate change, you can make that point without a moral message, without casting blame, without assigning blame. You can have a practical message. You can say, we in the water world spend our entire lives dealing with uncertainty and trying to insure against it and hedging against it, and creating systems, creating storage so that we have water when it's dry, and all the strategies we use to hedge against water shortage. That's a practical response to a real world problem, and that's what adaptation to climate change is as well. And I tell people, and so far not without much success, that the water community is really the sharp end of the spear of adaptation. We're the first community that's going to experience serious problems. We already are. And we're the first community that's going to be able to adapt to them because that's all we do. We adapt to climate and environmental circumstances. So I think it's a really exciting topic to talk about with the water community, and I know there's nobody in this room, water user or otherwise, that hasn't thought deeply about climate change because it's our world. But I think to talk about adaptation as what we do is a really exciting way to approach our work.
Thanks. That was really well put, and I couldn't agree more. I was having a conversation earlier with Doug about the water community's comfort level with this topic, and it is true, particularly in Colorado, that we are so dependent on year-to-year just weather and the changing variability of living in the mountains and the top of a watershed, that we're used to this process. It's looking further out and framing a lot of what we're doing as more long-term adaptation, not just year to year from the snowpack that we get each year. And this is maybe a big ask, but Doug, since you're so comfortable with this topic, can you help folks understand just the basic difference between mitigation and adaptation, and how you see those conversations divided, or maybe not at all divided, in those you talk to?
Yeah, so a lot of people like to lump climate change all together, and so it's sort of semantics, but with mitigation, that's really like what a lot of the attention's focused on, is like we need to reduce our carbon emissions. Very important. But on the flip side, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change. How are we going to adapt to them? So if you have drought in an area, you have sea level rise, that's adaptation. And so my focus area is on adaptation. I feel kind of fortunate I get to focus on that. And I think just following up on a point you made is that, well, if you're talking about adaptation, you're sort of giving up on mitigation. You know, that argument came up quite a bit in sort of the early aughts, and when Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth, don't talk about adaptation. You don't hear that as much anymore, and I really don't hear much criticism even when I focus on the podcast. If you're in the adaptation space, you're an adaptation professional, and there is such a thing. I think you're an adaptation professional.
I am now, and I changed my title to that.
We are counting on the mitigation people to do their job. The Paris Climate Accords, you need to get carbon emissions under control because we won't be able to adapt to these worst case scenarios. But we have a different skill set, we're working on a different area. Just because you're working on this adaptation side doesn't mean we're responsible for carbon emissions. Just know your skill set. And so with water managers, I think, and I have a lot to learn, but I think a lot of it does fall on the adaptation side. You know, you're gonna have to deal with issues of drought and managing that water. Maybe there's some carbon sequestration in some projects, but generally it's probably gonna be more of an issue of adaptation. It's more of your area. But it's an unspoken thing. Get the mitigation side under control, or we won't be able to adapt, and that's just a reality. But there's a lot to do right now that we can do right now.
Thanks. And I might just quickly add that I think when it comes to kind of the division of those two angles in addressing a changing future, we're going to see more pairing, especially as we focus more on that water and energy nexus. I think there's a lot of pairing there where you will see adaptation and mitigation being done together. I'm sure we can go into that, but I first want to kind of get some, kind of what is the state of the U.S. as far as our public's concern around this topic. And get a read, we had an interesting talk this morning about just the political climate of the U.S. in Colorado and where the forecast of what might happen. But Joshua comes from Yale with this incredible experience in research synthesis that his program touches on, and I would love if you can kind of introduce the crowd to the thesis of your most recent research. And I also, need a slide change if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, so the Yale program on climate change communication does twice yearly nationally representative surveys of the entire U.S., and they've been doing these surveys for the last 10 to 12 years, which means that we have an incredible view about how people feel about climate change and what they think should be done. And I will tell you that morality is actually a really powerful motivator, but I will say also it's moral to be practical and to do the adaptation, because that's going to protect people's lives. So we do these nationally representative surveys, and we ask people how they feel about climate change. Well, 7 out of 10 Americans think that climate change is real. We also do research into how they came to those beliefs. Anyways, we synthesize that all into the big idea, which is that there are really 6 Americas of how people feel about climate change. So this ranges from the alarmed. These are people who are worried about climate change, think that it's going to be affecting them personally, and are more likely to get involved in some sort of political advocacy or involved in their community around climate change. A lot of times they don't know, though, how to get involved. You have concerned, which are less personally engaged with climate, cautious, who have a lot of, basically they have a lot of questions. They think climate change is real, but they don't really know why it's happening, if it's going to affect them and their community. Disengaged, which are people who frankly, most of these people have 2 or 3 jobs, they have a family to raise, and they just haven't engaged with that issue or many other issues politically. And then we have doubtful and dismissive. Dismissive are the people who are actively saying climate change is not real and are more likely to be involved in political action to stop further climate action. But we just announced in January for the first time that alarmed is now the largest category of Americans. And you may think, okay, well, that's great. Those are people on the East Coast, in New Haven. And yes, there are people who are alarmed in New Haven, or people in LA, and that's a California thing. But really, when you look at the data, Colorado is about right in the middle of America. It's slightly more worried about climate change, like 1 point, but not statistically significant. And there are people who are alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive in every community across the country, whether you're a mining town and relying on fossil fuel extraction, or people who are installing solar panels. So there's a wide range of opinion, and so different people have different views. I could talk about this for 45 minutes, an hour, and so I will just refer to you to the Climate Change in America Mind, which has all sorts of data. It's our twice yearly report that summarizes a lot of this data, and also the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, which allow you to say, okay, well, that's really great. That's the national climate opinion, but what does it mean for my county, my city, or my congressional district, or the state of Colorado?
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
We ask each other questions?
Absolutely.
So I've looked at this stuff over the years too. I haven't really dug that much into it, and so that's encouraging. But I also look at that, and there's a real science to doing this polling, the survey work. Now you take that and you break it apart, but then you also have to look at the intensity of people and how they feel around the subject of climate change. And let's throw out a survey around guns or taxes, right. And then you have this measure. Have you guys been able to look at like the intensity versus other hot button issues?
Yeah, and we have. So I was having a conversation with the primary researcher on this, and he was saying, I'm seeing a real shift in how people feel about climate change. And amongst Democrats and liberal Democrats, for Democrats as a whole, it's a top 3 voting issue. And that's really a shift in how people feel about climate change and the intensity. Amongst liberal Democrats, it's the most important issue that they care about. For Republicans, let's say, what about conservative Republicans? It's all the way at the bottom, but what that does tell you is that there's not that much intensity about how people feel about climate change on the Republican side. And so you have a few people who are very loud and very dismissive of climate action, but for most conservative Republicans, they're not going to punish you at the ballot box or in an administrative proceeding because it's just not that important to them. But there are large portions of your community that it's extremely important, and it's become more important in the last year. And I think that the young people marching on the streets is a key sort of validation of that. The Washington Post did a poll last fall where they showed 1 out of 4 13 to 17-year-olds had been involved in some sort of climate activism or advocacy, which is just incredible. I was shocked when I saw that number because that is an incredible amount of intensity that the young people are calling and have a moral call to us to both do the adaptation and do the mitigation.
I want to highly recommend going to the Yale program's website. I was surfing there last night, and as a data geek, it's great. And they do go down to the county level, and the numbers in Colorado, the map in Colorado is really intriguing. I've never seen a map like that before. Yeah, of course, there's Boulder and there's Denver, of course, which are very concerned. But there's also a little crescent in western Colorado. and which I've never seen before. And it makes sense to me. It really does. And it's not just Pitkin County either. It's the whole sort of mountainous western part of the state that is really almost as concerned about climate change as Boulder and Denver, which I'd never seen on any issue before.
Yeah, Doug, go ahead.
My goodness, I can't believe I'm being the contrarian here. When I hear, like, for liberal Democrats, it's the number one issue. It's the number one issue for me. I've dedicated my life to it. But all of a sudden, when you hear those kind of things, that becomes part of the narrative. They become the ambassadors around that issue, not willingly, but it's just that becomes part of the story, and that's sometimes problematic because, you know, people's positions on these things aren't necessarily rational. They're tribal. It's identity politics, and all of a sudden, I don't know anything about the science, but it's the number one issue for those people that I don't like, and so that scares me a little bit. Although I'm happy it's the number one issue, but as you know, it's part of the narrative.
Absolutely. That it is concerning that Republicans don't feel as passionately as liberal Democrats about climate change, because it matters whether you're in a Republican town or a Democratic town. I am seeing some hope out there about Republicans getting more interested in the issue. We've seen Republican congressmen have sort of internal conversations within the Republican caucus in the House about climate change solutions. We've seen Republican congressmen introduce climate bills like Francis Rooney, who I worked with to help introduce that bill. So there is some hope there on the Republican side. And I will point out, there are Republicans who are alarmed. There are Republicans that are concerned. And there are Democrats that are dismissive. It's really about how people feel and relate to climate change, whether it's far away, distant, and not going to impact them, or is it something that's going to impact my community, or is it already impacting my community? And there are Republicans and Democrats on both sides of that.
I've got, this is interesting, and Doug, I'm glad you brought up more of that identity politics, because I don't think there's a single person in this room that said believes they'll be unaffected by a changing future. But what it does bring up is it's obvious that this long-term change in our future brings up a lot of existential questions, and it can be a really heavy topic for folks. It elicits a big range of emotions, from extremely passionate to dismissive. And I'm curious, maybe Andy, this is even for you as someone who's a practitioner of this message, how do you see that playing out in the stakeholders and community that you're regularly engaged with? Do you find that people who are really worried are activated for action, or do they feel stuck? And there's something about just giving people the data and the information that can be paralyzing. And how do you move forward with the message?
Yeah, that's the right word, is paralyzing. And my daughter, who is 12 years old, she turned 13 yet? No, she's still 12. Feels paralyzed. She's 12 years old. 12-year-olds aren't supposed to be thinking about this sort of thing, but she is really worried. And she doesn't know what to do. She's written a letter to her congressman, but her congressman's already supportive. She doesn't know it, and that's why the Greta Thunbergs of the world come about. And it's why I try and draw the distinction in my water work between adaptation and mitigation. Because in adaptation, I don't think you can be paralyzed. I don't think I think the way forward is pretty clear. There's no emotional freight to it. There's no blamed casting. There's no you're on the wrong team. Everyone's got to work together because it's obvious something needs to happen. And which is why I find it much more productive to talk that way. Now, I still try and save energy, and I still am very concerned about the mitigation side. But for the water community, I think the way to talk about climate change with our customers and with our neighbors is through this question of adaptation, and it's a very serious, hard road ahead.
my 16-year-old and 11-year-old could care less about climate change.
Really?
They believe in it, but, you know.
Dad's working on it. It's covered.
They're just rebelling.
Well, personally, this has been a topic that I've been passionate about for my entire life, and I had those existential crises when I was young, and I could admit to this entire audience, and I've talked about this openly, I've had to seek help and to process those kinds of big questions that I felt as a kid. No one else around me in Midwest Ohio would talk to me about. I felt like I was concerned about something that I was reading so much information about, and no one else around me had any sort of space to have that conversation of what it means, and I had to go searching elsewhere to find those people, and I do have a lot of sympathy for those Greta Thunbergs of the world, because I get what that feels like, to feel that weight as a kid and have no actionable what can I do. And so a question that maybe many of us in this audience have had, or definitely on stage, is do you ever have individuals just as their solo person come to you and say, what am I supposed to do? Do you have any resources or pieces of advice on those who may or may not be engaged in their political system or understand how this is a much broader system issue, but what kind of resources would you give individuals? And then I'll ask about changing the entire system after. Just kidding.
Okay. So reacting to the young people being anxious, which I've been hearing more and more about. It's not something that your daughter's alone on. I was working with a advocacy and educational organization, and that works with young people and teachers, and they were saying people are really anxious. And so we give organizations, whether they're advocacy or educational or decision makers, 5 sort of key themes that are good to say about climate change. Scientists agree, it's real, it's bad, it's us, but there's hope. And I think when I think about that last one, it's the thing that's most important to me personally, is finding these ways where there is hope. So whether it's natural solutions on the coast of Florida or in Colorado that limit water use and thus make people more resilient to climate change, or it's all the solar panels that I saw coming in to Westminster today, or it's local elected officials getting involved, talking to the state legislature or their congressperson about what they want to see in terms of climate solutions, whether it's adaptation or mitigation. Those things give me hope, because together, working together, we're going to be able to address and avoid the worst parts of this. That's what gives me hope and helps me avoid some of that anxiety.
Yeah, the individual action's always been a tough one for me, and especially with adaptation. I get those questions occasionally. My listeners will reach out to me, and what can I do individually? And sometimes I'm kind of stumped. I'm like, well, you can adapt your front yard, but that's really not going to make a difference. And I guess the cynic in me is that you really just need to educate yourself. Get involved with politics, make sure you're supporting the right people, but educating yourself that when these things start to come up, you're prepared to go along with it. Like carbon tax is one of the big solutions to mitigating carbon. If you're educated around the issue of climate change, it might not be such a leap for you to support candidates that are up for carbon taxes. And so, educating yourself is such a big thing, because, we need our leaders to make the tough decisions, and I think that's lost a lot of times, because individual action, you always want people to do the right thing at an individual level. Probably one of the most important things is just finding a good climate change podcast.
It was a trick question on purpose, because I have trouble answering it as well. Andy,
right.
Do you have any tips?
Yeah. So when the human race faces difficult problems, it's often the case that leadership comes from very, very unlikely places. And I used to, when people ask me this question, I used to say, well, drive a little less, and maybe change your diet, maybe vote for this candidate or that candidate. And now I tell them, be a leader. You have a network of people, and they may be Democrats, they may be Republicans, they may be anything. They may be anywhere on this scale. But you have the ability to talk to them. And there are, creating an effective message is pretty simple. Famously, there's 5 C's to a effective message. 4 of them are easy. Clear, concise, connecting, meaning matters to the person you're talking to, compelling, and the 5th one's hard, and the 5th one's contrasting. That's the what else message. And or the or else message, I should say. What does this world look like if we don't adapt and we don't mitigate? But you have that ability, even if it's only 5 people or 10 people, or and in fact, a climate change activist is going to have a circle of friends that are climate change activists, which is often very, very frustrating to the environmental community. I'll let you in on a little secret. We're very frustrated that we always talk to each other, and because we don't have the opportunity to do anything else. But you all in the water community do, and so as I said, leadership comes from unexpected places, and I think the water community is one of those places.
Well, I couldn't agree more that leadership within your own community matters, whether that community is 5 people, 10 people, or 100,000 people, or 1 million people. One of the things that our research shows is that lots of people are worried about climate change, lots of people think it's real, lots of people think that scientists agree, but they don't know that other people think that. And they don't know that whether their friend or family member thinks that climate change is real and we should do something about it, whether it's adaptation or mitigation. And so that creates a spiral of silence where people are not having the conversation about how we adapt or mitigate our way into solutions.
So I do want to be cognizant of time, and I am so excited to have these folks with such a range and history of experience. I do want to take, if there are any questions at all from the audience from what you've heard, just see if there's any popcorn hands. I know it is 5:06. Go ahead.
Wait.
Oh, wait, never mind. We're micing you. I was ready to do speed round questions. Just go.
A comment about what you just said about only talking to folks who are already climate. And I think that's untrue. I think there's people who don't agree with you all around you, just like all the people who say, I don't know anybody who supports Trump. And the reason the perception is that you only talk to climate people is because often that conversation begins with, everybody knows that climate change is real, and only stupid people aren't worried about it. And then I'm going to tell you about climate change and be surprised that there isn't anybody in your circle who pipes up and disagrees with you and then presents themselves as a stupid person who, whatever, right? Same thing with Trump. I sat in a taxi with a bunch of people, and there were several folks who were like, gosh, Trump, he's such an idiot. I can't believe he's actually made it this far into the election. This was several years ago. And I knew for a fact that several of the folks were Trump supporters, but did they say anything? No, because they didn't want to lump themselves into the idiots who believed such and such. The conversation often begins that way. And I think you'll find that there's a broader appeal, a broader conversation if it doesn't start out with, everybody knows that, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, Don't you all know that? Because it really happens. Now, a different question, something that I didn't hear about is the trade-offs between priorities. We had the 6 classes there. I'd like to know where the people belong who accept the climate change issues, but feel that economic resources are better served by keeping children alive in third world countries, or bringing, raising economic prosperity throughout the world. These are also complicated questions that compete for the same resources. Where do they fit in those 6 categories?
Thanks. I think it's a really good point to always really do a self-check of how you're introducing this topic in a way that is an open table for discussion. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because there's so much I've learned in the water community in Colorado in the last 5 years that really starts with just getting to know each other first in a way that is not, and I never start a conversation in a way that is, this is true, don't you agree? Because that's not a conversation. You're just asking for a poll and a response. I'm curious, I'm sure you, I know that Doug had an interesting podcast on, I wrote down the man's name, but you know what I'm referring to before I even look it up.
Yeah, just quickly, and first, I never start a conversation with everyone knows and you're stupid if you don't. Usually I find people that are contrarians typically the loudest folks, not the climate people. I actually did an interview with a gentleman named Mark Morano, who's been a longtime skeptic. He worked for Rush Limbaugh. He has just been out there getting in climate scientists' faces for decades. I had him come on the podcast not to argue or debate with him, and he knew this in advance, that I wanted to just know what his motivations were, what's his background, and so we had like a 50-minute conversation where he just walked me through his history. He was a bit crazy in some ways, but it was a great conversation. Then I had a professional science communicator, Randy Olson, come on. He listened to my interview with Mark and then dissected it and said, why is Mark so effective? Why is the climate movement so ineffective? And it was just a behind-the-curtains look at what climate skeptics are. And this guy's a professional skeptic. It's been overwhelmingly my most popular episode. People were just like, I heard from listeners saying, I was scared to listen because I thought he was going to change my mind. They're like, no, he's crazy. But it was fascinating to hear him. And I was like, that's what I was going for. And so you got to give people space to kind of explain it. But at the same time, if they're not going to listen to you and respect where you're kind of coming from, like, it's a two-way kind of street where people are shouting at each other. So,
yeah. So, I think he probably wasn't crazy because he has a world in which he exists where there's a logic to what he thinks, and that's totally reasonable in his worldview. We all have worldviews that are based on our identity and our experiences, and that is okay. And we all start the conversation from someplace different. So it's good for people to know that they're not alone, but it's also good for people to start a conversation about what do you think about this? What do you want to see happen? How are you feeling about this? And then you can start to have a conversation about what I believe. And to go to your question about trade-offs and intensity. Most of the people who are worried about children starving somewhere else are internationalists and have communitarian beliefs. And so they're more likely to be alarmed and not think that there's a trade-off. There are people who think that there's a action on environment versus action on the economy trade-off. And they could be in the cautious, disengaged, doubtful, or dismissive, depending on some of their other beliefs. I think you have one over there.
Oh, we've got one or two. Oh. I think this will be our last question.
We're waiting. I just want to say that conversation with Mark, he knew I was going to have that conversation with Randy. It wasn't like we went behind his back to do that. I just want to make that clear.
No, I'm really interested in that. I'm going to download that tonight.
Ooh, yeah, another download. Let's see how many. Go ahead.
I am curious about whether there are litmus test questions. The most extreme one I've thought of is you disbelieve in climate and some climate...
We can't hear you very well. Can you hold it closer?
A litmus test question. How does this kind of thing work? My litmus test is, if you don't believe in climate, how dare you use medical doctors? Their science is even more complicated. Would that do any good?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Did you know?
So I'm not sure that it's, when you're talking to people who are cautious or disengaged, doubtful, it's helpful for moving them along to have a litmus test. And what we've seen in terms of the trends in the data are, as people get more information, as they realize that they're not alone, they are becoming more, the cautious are becoming concerned, the concerned are becoming alarmed. And so I think that there's hope for everybody, whether they're doubtful, disengaged, cautious, or concerned. I think this is an urgent issue, and you need to, if you're planning a campaign about who to reach out to, you do need to think about where you put your resources. So there are lots of strategic reasons to do different things. But I think approaching people with openness to where they are and realizing that a lot of people are worried about this, but they don't know what to do, gives you the best chance of having a conversation about that's productive.
Yeah, I think another way to put that, it's an excellent point, is you shouldn't think of yourself as educating people. You should be thinking of yourself as persuading people. There's a difference. And when you're persuading people, you're recognizing that they have a valid point of view. And it comes from who they are and what they think about a lot of different things. And you're respecting that and you're trying to change it. When you go about with a paradigm of educating people, they tend to sort of peel away because they're being talked down to or perceive they're being talked down to. So that it's a really useful paradigm when you're going into a conversation with someone whose behavior you're trying to change.
So are we wrapping it up here? I had one I wanted to just...
Go for it.
Well, it's just, I want to get this sort of point across too, is this audience here, water managers, and I think you represent people working out in the field, you're working in the cities, and you guys are in this sort of unique position, you're ambassadors for some of these issues, and one of the things that comes up with a lot with my guests is that if they are working out in the field with farmers and such, sometimes they don't want to talk about climate change. So they're like, well, they don't want to hear that. So you talk about adaptation or extreme events or flooding events. And my advice on my podcast, and it's easy enough to do when I'm behind my microphone, is like, don't do that. Like, you think you're like trying to avoid a controversial subject, don't go lecturing them on the carbon cycle, but don't shy away from climate change, because you, and I'm not speaking for all of you, but if you think climate change is real and you know why it's driving what you're doing, you're condescending to those people, and you might not be doing that on purpose, but it's happening because you think something else and you refuse to kind of share that message with these people out there. And don't go whacking a hornet's nest. Don't do anything stupid, but I think there's a huge opportunity, and we could have years go by where everyone's tiptoeing around the issue of climate change. And I think a lot of the people in this, and you could disagree with me, if we'll see you for drinks later, that you guys, some of you are in positions of communicating how important this is, and it's associated with climate change. Don't shy away from it.
I'm just going to close on this open call for, if you all are out and about and get questions around how your stakeholders or your community, your board, whoever wants to integrate specific communication resources around the topic of climate change, there are a whole host of incredible online resources, Yale Communications being one of them, but there are many out there around, whether it's a short snippet from a podcast that you can use to explain an issue that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. If you're curious, I have a huge library of those types of resources, and always happy to share that wealth of things that I've dug up from the corners of the interwebs. That said, this is a conversation about conversing, and it's tough. It's a tough thing to really sit with the intensity of this issue and how it affects the water community in such an intense way, without bringing in people's, where they come from before they sit down at that table. And it is first and foremost, I like to always approach every conversation with the recognition that that human has a life and an experience that is entirely valid, and that is always a strong way to move forward in discussing these topics with more of an explorer and curiosity lens than a issue versus issue lens. I'm sure all of you want to get out of here, probably myself included, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon, whatever happy hours. So if there's nothing else from Doug, I'll take his word from the grandstand.